Welcome everybody to the webcast on less complex entities. I am Payman Momenan and I'm a staff of the New Zealand Audit and Assurance Standards Board. The aim today is to walk you through the ISP discussion paper on the audits of less complex entities and more importantly, to get your feedback on the topic. During this presentation, you will be presented with some poll questions. Please answer these questions to share your opinions with us about the specific matters that are included in the discussion paper. In case you have any questions, please know that I will answer them at the end of the session. So let's start by looking at the history of the project. The ISB was formed in 2002. And as you can see on the slide, from 2002 to 2009, the IASB was working on the Clarity project to ensure that the auditing standards were clear and concise to aid audit quality. There was a clarification project, and as part of the redraft, the IASB introduced the specific application material paragraphs to assist auditors of smaller entities in applying the standards. These application material paragraphs for smaller entities still remain in the ISAs today. The post-implementation review of the ISAs included a specific focus on the impact of applying new and revised ISAs in audits of small-medium entities through a survey carried on by the IASB over 2 years. That survey found the introduction of the clarified ISAs had positive impact, particularly on audit quality and quality control. There was also more focus on risk, and it was noted that this focus on risk improved the quality of the recommendations to management. However, it was also noted that documentation was a significant issue for SMEs. This feedback, together with other things that the ISB learned along the way, have informed the project that the ISB is undertaking today. In early 2015, the IASB formed an informal group to look at issues and audits of SMEs. This group eventually morphed into the current working group that are now considering this matter. In 2017, the first global conference on this topic was held in Paris, and ideas between many countries were exchanged. And in 2018, the ISB discussed the results of its informal group and the feedback from the Paris meeting and decided to establish a formal working group. The working group issued its discussion paper in April 2019, and we are here today to go through this paper. Please note that the IASB is focusing on audits at this stage. This does not mean that the IASB will not consider engagements other than audits in future as a potential solution, but at this particular project, the focus is in auditing. And also, this is the research phase of this project. The working group will pass on the feedback from this research to the IASB for them to decide the best way forward. The IASB remains very open-minded at this stage and considers all views and recommendations. So we would love to use this opportunity to ensure that your views and feedback is reflected back to the IASB to aid them and to achieve the objective of this project. The discussion paper is dedicated to 4 different matters. These 4 different matters include what is a less complex entity, factors that adversely affect the scalability of the auditing standards that are either outside the scope of this project or the control of the IASB, and the factors that adversely affect the scalability of the ISAs that are within the scope of this project, and finally, the possible ways forward. So let's start with the first issue, which is what is a less complex entity? As I mentioned in the introduction, the IASB initial attempt at addressing a scalability of the standards for small entities was by introduction of a specific application materials for smaller entities. However, as it explained in the discussion paper, the IASB does not believe that size of an engagement is a good proxy for complexity. The complexity of an audit engagement is more closely related to the risk of the engagement and not size of the client. And the complexity should affect the scalability of the standard much more than the size. And this is why the IASB has decided to use the term less complex entity and not the existing smaller entity to acknowledge that certain large entities can be relatively less complicated to audit, and certain smaller entities can be quite complex. However, the definition used in the paper is actually the existing definition of smaller entities in the existing ISAs. The definition includes certain qualitative characteristics for such entities. The qualitative characteristics are not exhaustive or exclusive. One of the key characteristics of a less complex entity is that ownership and management is concentrated within few individuals. For example, a small company that is managed by the sole owner is a very good example of such an entity. Other qualitative characteristics may include simple and straightforward transaction, simple record keeping, few lines of business, few internal controls, few level of management responsible for broad range of controls, and etc. Most of these characteristics, with potentially the exception of simple and straightforward transactions and simple record keeping, are generally size characteristics that do not necessarily relate to the risk. And this is to some extent contrary to the stated objective of the discussion paper that complexity and not size should be the criteria for less or more complex entities. And this definition becomes particularly important should one of the options that we discuss at the conclusion of today's session is chosen by the IASB, and that is having a separate standard. Otherwise, its importance will be less prominent. We would like to know your opinion about the appropriateness of this definition. Do you think that there are any other QCs that need to be included? Are the qualitative characteristics included in the definition appropriate? So please let us know your thoughts by completing the upcoming poll questions. So I'm gonna run poll question 1. Okay. So I hope that you're seeing your poll, so please answer. I see some people started to answer. Let's give it about 30 seconds. Okay. I think we are about concluding on that. I'm gonna close it. And I think about 50% of people believe that license entity can be less complex entity, which is interesting. Thank you for your responses. 39 did not agree with that, which is also quite interesting. So the next question we are asking is, okay, so you should see it by now. It's simply asking you about the appropriateness of the definition. So are you happy with the definition? So we will wait another few seconds. Okay, so more than 60% have been voted. Okay. That's a minute. Okay, I close this one. And again, 56% of the participants agree, and 33% say they're not sure. She's again, that's an interesting response. Oh, so before I launch the next question, I want to provide some context to it. Um, as you noted, the definition as presented in the paper focus on the entity, which is pretty good. But we want to know if there are also audit characteristics that generally apply to these less complex entities that can be included. For example, as just an example, audits of small charities and similar entities are usually completed a few months after the balance date, as opposed to a listed entity, which is usually completed much sooner. Uh, this may in turn affect the type of evidence at the disposal of the auditor to address the risk. So this is not particular characteristic of an entity, but it's a particular characteristic of an audit potentially. And we would like to know if you believe these type of characteristics have a place or not. So that is what this next question is about. Also, the poll doesn't really let me let you guys to send me any more information. But if your answer is yes, I will appreciate it if you can send me a brief description via email. And my email is actually provided in some of the following slides. Okay, so we still 20 more seconds to go. That's pretty good. Okay, so 59% believe that it's the yes answers. I hope that some of you will send me some more specific examples of these characteristics, because that will be very helpful for a response. And the next question is a similar type of question. Just any other characteristic that you believe is missing. And again, if you believe the answer is yes, we will really appreciate it if you can send us a bit more on it via email or any other method that you like. You can call me if you prefer. Okay, thank you. I think I closed this one as well. And it seems the majority are not sure on this particular question. Okay, thank you. Okay. So at this stage, The ISP is trying to identify the root causes for the scalability and proportionality issues that we discussed. The ISP has identified a range of underlying factors and has classified these into two separate categories. Those that are outside the ISP control or that are scoped out of this project, and those that the ISP believes are within the scope of this less complex entities project. The factors that are outside the ISP control are actually shown in the blue box on the left-hand side of the slide, and they include legal and other requirements for an audit. For example, in New Zealand, Financial Market Conduct Act and Financial Reporting Act and Charities Act determine what entities are required to be audited and which entities are not required to be audited. And commercial consideration relating to an audit, technology, methodology, and education in people. So these are all very important matters, and while they're outside the control of the ISP, they still are very interested to receive feedback about them. And there are also other matters or other factors, if you like, that are excluded from this project. The most prominent ones is the engagement audit and audit that can potentially be very useful in this space, but the ISP has decided just to focus on audit at this stage and in this particular project, so that's why that is scoped out. And enhance accessibility to ISAs, again, that's something probably on its own, and it's not something they would like to address as part of this particular project. And finally, value of an audit and public expectations are also excluded from the standard. But both the ISP and us at the NZ ASP are very interested in knowing a little bit more about these because they actually drive the underlying demand for an audit engagement. So let me run the next poll question, which is related to the value of audits. Okay, so the question is, if you are being asked about value of an audit by your client, by the sort of less complex entities that you engage with, are they asking what is the value of an audit? Okay, so there are a few more, give it a few more seconds to get a few more responses, hopefully. Okay, close it soon. That is lovely. I see that 88% of you responded that yes, value of an audit is a significant, and you're basically being asked by your client about value and audit, which is it's very, very relevant to what we do. We definitely make sure that that is reflected in our responses. And another one is about sort of the commercial aspect of an audit, and is the question is, do you believe that the fee pressure in this space is actually higher than other engagements or other audit engagements? Okay, I think I close this one too. Again, an overwhelming positive response to this question, which means it's a very relevant matter, and we probably need to look a bit further into. Thank you for your response. And my final question is about sort of the legal or the statutory requirements regime for auditing in New Zealand. So Mike, the question is the New Zealand legal requirements for entities to have an audit appropriate? Or no, the statutory audit thresholds are too low, which means that you believe that more entities should be exempted from statutory audits. And the next one is that thresholds are too high, which means you believe that more entities should be included. Okay. I close this one. Then the majority believes that they are appropriate, which is good to know. So the next section is about challenges that are within the scope of the ISB mandate. The discussion paper highlights certain areas. Each of these are explained in more details in the discussion paper itself, and it is possible that the current language and basic approach that they use in developing their standards actually has resulted in less clarity and more lengthy standards. They acknowledge that. And they say ISA 540, which is Audit of Accounting Estimates, is now much longer than the extant one, as an example of the standards becoming more lengthy and complicated. And the ISB also say they received a similar feedback on the proposed ISA 3115 risk assessment. And they also say documentation continues to be a big problem for less complex and smaller audits. And that is in turn maybe driven by lack of clarity of what needs to be documented and the extent of the required documentation, and that the requirements at times can be unclear of what is expected and is not clear how they may apply to audit of less complex entities. And one of the other feedback they receive is that within the standards themselves, there are not adequate guidance about how the requirements may apply in less complex entity. But this is an interesting one, because if they start to provide more guidance, they can potentially make the standards even lengthier than they are. So they sort of pause a bit on that one. And finally, they identify certain standards problematic from a scalability perspective. And these include auditor responsibility for considering fraud in an audit engagement, risk assessment and understanding the client and its environment, and particularly the requirements around internal controls. Many people believe that where you are unable to use or rely on internal controls as a sort of evidence, some of the work that you do in that area does not add any real value to the audit, and they question why they should do it. Auditing accounting estimates is another problematic standard that is listed, and our experience with New Zealand auditors indicates that they actually have very similar concerns. And for example, the relationship between the internal control and whether or not they actually add to the auditing of the entity. So finally, the discussion paper explores 3 possible actions to address this scalability challenge. The discussion paper is clear that the ISB has not excluded any options at this stage. The discussion paper just says that these are the 3 possible solutions that they have identified, and they may consider any other solutions if they ever come forward. And so the very first one, or probably the more obvious one, is the revising and writing the existing standards in a more LCE friendly manner. And they hope by doing that, this should provide them more clarity of what auditors need to do and how to do it, especially when they're auditing a less complex entity. And they basically say if they want to do that, there are a couple of ways they can do it. One is by revising all the standards as part of one big project. And because the ISB agenda is already very full, they basically say that that approach is probably not very feasible, and they believe the alternative, which is revising their standards from a scalability point of view, when the standards are being open for review for any other reason, is a more practical approach. And if they do that for every standard that is open, eventually they may incorporate the scalability considerations in the standards. And the main method that the discussion paper propose for actually making the standards more scalable is basically the building block approach. So they say the requirements should start from the most fundamental that are relevant to all engagements, and then the more complex requirements, or the requirements that arise because of complexity, should be then added on. So that should help with reading the standards. Another method that they have, an alternative, if you like, for revising the existing standards, is to come up with a whole new suite of standards. And as you may be aware, some jurisdictions, some other countries, they have already started experimenting with this idea. For example, Nordic countries in Europe, they've put forward a suite of auditing standards a few years ago that was like a brief version of the ISAs. And also in Sri Lanka, as another example, that they basically put a separate auditing standards for entities that are not publicly accountable and that only prepare special purpose accounts using historical basis of accounting, if you like historical cost basis of accounting. And so they basically have separate standard. So that's one way of going forward. And they also say if there is a separate standard, there are 2 options for developing a separate standard. One is to basically use the same risk-based approach to auditing that underlines the ISAs today. And another method is to develop a standards using another framework. But at this stage, they really have no concrete idea about that, what that other framework might be. They just say, for example, it may be more giving more weight to substantive approach to auditing as opposed to a risk-based approach. But that's another possibility that they're exploring. And finally, they basically say another form of improving scalability is guidance and providing more specific guidance. I would like to remind you that the ISB actually does have a lot of guidance in this area already, and they already have application like I think it's a 2-volume publication on how to apply ISAs in SMEs. But they may believe that a different form of guidance may be more helpful. They also say another way of providing guidance is to include special application packs for new and revised standards. So when a revised or a new standard is being released, there's actually an application pack that is targeted for the auditors of LSEs to help them to better apply it. So we really want to know what is your opinion about one of these options. So the next and last question is about which one of these options that I discussed is your preferred one. Okay. That is very good. Thank you very much. And okay, thank you very much for your feedback. In case you wanted to know more about this, the actual discussion paper is, you can access it via the XRB website, and it's under Assurance Standards in Development. You can see a copy. Also, I've included my email address in case you would be kind enough to send me more information about these other characteristics or anything other thing about these questions that you think may be helpful in forming our response to the IASB. Also, if you would like to give us a submission on this paper, I would really encourage you and invite you to do that. Again, the information, more information on how to do it is on the website, and I think our deadline is 22nd of August. Finally, we're also running a survey which we put on the website for you to complete, and we will appreciate it if you can give us a bit more time, or you encourage your colleagues to give us a bit more information on this matter. So thank you very much. I can check if I have any questions, or if any questions, it's the best time to ask it. Otherwise, I think it is the conclusion of the session, and I want to thank you again for your time, and I hope that you have find this worthwhile. We definitely find your input very valuable and very helpful. So thank you, and bye.